This is Tokens. I'm Lee C. Camp.
Slow violence is an interesting concept that I find to be very helpful in describing what we see around the planet.
That's Chris Doran, professor of religion at Pepperdine University.
I do argue that climate denial may be a sin.
Chris refuses to accept a sort of wait until heaven Christian faith in that does not take seriously the grave issues facing us now.
Oftentimes what I hear in churches is this sort of like, I'm going to want to go to heaven, so I have this hope that that's going to do, but it's sort of a passive waiting game, and I don't have to do much until then. But instead, the early Christian witness said, while you're sitting around waiting, you're supposed to be doing this really profoundly important work, and thus we can go out and love our neighbor in new ways.
Chris is the author of a recent book entitled Hope in the Age of Climate Change, Creation Care This Side of the Resurrection, in which he makes the argument that
if the resurrection is objectively true, then everything we do matters in a new way. If we know that God wins in the end, it means that certain things now don't have to be this way. We have a vision of what a better place looks like, where you love your neighbors, where you're just to your neighbors, where you actually have clean air, clean water, and decent food. If the resurrection is objectively true, it's supposed to engage us to be courageous. It's supposed to engage us into seeking justice for those who have little or no voice.
All this coming right up. Chris Doran is professor of religion at Pepperdine University in Malibu, California. His research and teaching have been on a variety of issues related to the intersection between theology and science. His current work focuses on developing theological responses to climate change and its effects on human and non-human creatures, as well as the rest of creation. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you. Thank you very much for letting me be here.
Yes, we're grateful to have you. How did you come to give the attention you have given to climate change?
Yeah, I think there was a confluence of a number of things that I think are only starting to become more apparent to me as I get into my mid-40s now. I spent a lot of time outdoors as a kid, and whether it was, kind of hiking in mountains or just being outside playing, that I think those things were more meaningful to me than I expected them to be. They weren't, sort of something that I reflected on in my youth, but the older I've gotten, the more I've realized being outdoors, being amongst things that are not made by human hands was a big deal to just my formation and who I am. And then I started my academic work sort of in the intersection of what's called the religion and science, or the science and religion field, looking at evolution and genetics and neuroscience and some of those things. And then I taught a class one summer on ecology and public policy and Christianity and the sort of relationship of those. And the student feedback I had was tremendous. It really was different than the student feedback I had on a number of other classes that I was teaching in the science and religion field. And so that was a hugely big shaper to what I was doing. And I thought, as I was reading the climate science at that time, so this was back in like 2005, 2006, I realized something was going on. And if my students would respond to it and start talking about it a little bit more, and I thought there was something going on, that those things kind of came together for me. And so I started shifting to teaching more about creation care and climate change and the impacts of climate change on human and non-human creatures. And then just my own theological training, is sort of one where I am systematic and philosophical theologian by training. And those things that I was thinking about, God the Creator, God the Redeemer, the importance of the resurrection, that those things all kind of came together for me, just not just in my personal walk, but in the sense of how I was exploring the 2,000-year history of Christianity.
And you're connecting basic Christian orthodoxy directly with climate activism.
Yeah, I think the central thesis of my book is that if the resurrection is objectively true, and I believe it is, and that the Apostle Paul's saying that if the resurrection was not true, then we're all fools, taking that as the starting point, then everything we do matters in a new way. I think that's an important thing for us to consider, is how do we live every single day as if the resurrection matters? And not just on Easter Sunday or maybe a couple of special sermons throughout the year, but every single day. And that's why in my tradition, the centrality of the resurrection is supposed to be an every Sunday event. And I was really taken by some of the early Christian witnesses in the first few centuries who said their whole lives were changed dramatically by the resurrection. And their courage, their sense of kindness, their sense of generosity, all of those things were inspired by saying that Jesus was alive and had risen from the tomb. And I think that, to me, it helps shape how I understand the work that I'm supposed to be doing now, to not just inspire people to see God in creation, but to inspire the kind of, as I put it in the book, I think God dares us to try to make the not yet already. And that tension between the already and not yet that the Apostle Paul talks about, I think we live in a dare to God saying, try to train the not yet into the already. And that's what I'm trying to do, I think.
Could you spell out for a little bit more for us then some of the specifics of what that move might look like? What does it look like to make the not yet already?
There's some things like what we're seeing, especially during this pandemic. We cannot wipe every tear. We cannot heal every sorrow. Those are some things that are going to have to wait until the very end, when God brings the consummation of all things to its complete end. But I think we can look out at creation and say, what does it look like for all people to breathe clean air? What does it look like for all people to drink clean water? What does it look like for all people to eat nutritionally dense food that is reasonably accessible and cost effective? Because I think those are things that signal God's presence in the world, that God cares not just about human people, but that those three things especially signal that the rest of creation is operating well, when there's clean air, when there's clean water, and when we have a relationship with the land where it's producing nutritionally dense food. And so I think those, to me, are just three examples that I work on quite a lot, not just only in my home local community, but as I teach students about how Christians should be concerned about those things that are impacting people's lives. Because those three things right there, clean air, clean water, and decent food, cause so much illness and health problems for humans and non-humans around the planet. And we have to be very thoughtful about how we understand God's work through those sorts of things that impact people's lives every single day.
You're connecting basic Christian orthodoxy with these issues in ways that, as we've already kind of indicated, seems counterintuitive to some given the cultural climate in which we find ourselves. But you're also maybe cutting against the grain, at least of climate change deniers, who will oftentimes depict a concern with climate change as utopian and unrealistic. But you're speaking in very practical, realistic terms.
Yeah, I have actually a section in my book where I do provocatively argue that climate denial may be a sin of some sort, whether it's a sin of omission, commission, or ignorance. I have some delineations listed in the book on that. But, as someone who comes from a science background, there's one piece of me that says, some of the greatest scientists that have ever existed have been Christian. And those are things, understanding how God created the planet, how God's created the universe, I think is something that is so tremendously important to my own faith walk and the faith walk of countless scientists who have come before me and are presently in our society and societies around the world. So I think that, just to speak to that, it is really important for us to think about how the history of Christianity has fostered an open and honest investigation of creation and how creation works. But also, Scripture talks a lot about, particularly the Israelite prophets, the relationship between the land and the poor. And if the land is treated well, the poor is being treated well. And if the poor are being treated well, the land is being treated well. And that sort of ancient wisdom insight, I think, is only borne out by the science, that when we see we are treating the land well, we also probably exist in societies where the poor among us are being treated better, and vice versa. So I think there's some real live kinds of insights from scriptural witness that it would be easy to slough aside and say they're ancient wisdom kind of insights, but they are far more, I think, impactful to how we see what's going on the planet. Even if these things were written 4,000 or 5,000 years ago, there were some really bright people that were communicating God's truth a long time ago. And I think I want to be part of that tradition that carries that forward and says, let's take seriously what they were taking seriously and see if that will change people's lives now. And ultimately, Lee, I think the ability for us to see the gospel as something that's transformative to every single part of human and creation's existence is what I think the challenge of the resurrection brings us. Everything matters, not just some things.
Related to that notion of climate change denial perhaps being construed as a sin, you also note, quoting, I think, eco-critic Rob Nixon, who will speak of victims of environmental change as victims of slow violence.
Yeah, slow violence is an interesting concept that I find to be very helpful in describing what we see around the planet. So we can think of spontaneous events that are incredibly violent, like unfortunate mass shootings or wars, or maybe a bomb is dropped on a group of people. And there's an instantaneous kind of explosive event that we can all look at and say, my goodness, this should not happen. And this is incredibly violent. But what we're seeing around the planet, I'll give you one example on the human side and one on the non-human side. On the human side, we see cultures like the Pacific Island nations where rising sea levels are taking over their ability to gather fresh water, or the king tides are becoming more and more frequent. And so salt water is impacting their ability to grow food. Those things are happening at a very slow pace. It's been taken decades and decades and decades for them to get to those points, but their cultures are being irreparably harmed. We know there's countries like Tuvalu and Vanuatu and the Maldives and even Fiji that are looking for new places to live. So those are slowly violent events. Their cultures are coming to an end. Their ways of life are coming to an end. But it's not an instantaneous sort of event that happens on one day. It happens over decades and decades. And that's just the Pacific Islands. I mean, I could talk about places in the middle of Africa or in the middle of Asia where desertification is happening very, very slowly, but it's causing tens of millions of people to either be internally displaced or externally displaced. On the non-human side, scientists tell us that we're living through the sixth great extinction of this planet right now. And I think that's one of those things where it's not instantaneous, where we don't wake up one day and say, well, there's X amount of species that have gone extinct. It's been happening over the last couple of hundreds of years in a slow but cumulative way. And now all of a sudden we're waking up and realizing, oh, this, mountain cat is no longer present, or this bear is no longer present, or this kind of marine mammal is no longer present in the way that we see. And those, I think what Nixon is trying to get at is that's a type of violence, but it's not that instantaneous violence that we're accustomed to, but it has the same practical effect. Things are gone. Cultures are wiped out. People's ways of life that have existed for 1,000 years are eradicated. Species that have lived on this planet for millions of years are no longer here. And I think we have to acknowledge that as Christians for what it is and ask ourselves, should we be mourning and grieving that? Yes, absolutely. And should we be looking to arrest those sorts of things when we can? Yes, absolutely.
How would you characterize your description of hope as different from those who will use hope or eschatological notions of going to heaven as leading to quietism, passivism, acting as if we don't really have to be concerned with this earth, we don't really have to be concerned with history because we have a hope elsewhere?
Yeah, that's a really important question. So, I mean, the title of the book is Hope in the Age of Climate Change, because I think what I was trying to do was to convince myself at some level that the resurrection hope matters and was real. I'm a survivor of childhood abuse, and there was parts of the Christian story that didn't resonate with me because so much evil happened to me as a child. And so as I sort of unpacked that term, I found the Christian understanding of hope is different than, say, the cultural expectation of optimism. To me, optimism is not just seeing the glass half full, but this sort of interesting inevitability that things will get better because things just always get better. There's sort of optimism in that sense. There's sort of optimism from the sense of social and economic privilege that things will get better because they've always got better. But, wealthy people can say that really easily. But Christianity builds on this idea of hope, at least I think so, through the Apostle Paul. Hope comes from this three-part definition in the Old Testament that you have an expectation of a future event. You have trust that that expectation can come true because you trust in either a deity or a socioeconomic force or yourself. And then you have a patience of waiting. And Christians, through the resurrection, came to this idea that the expectation of the future with the resurrection meant that God wins. death no longer has the final say. And you could trust in God in a new way, maybe than some of their Israelite forefathers and mothers thought, because if God had the power even over death, then trust has this new depth to it. And I find that to be a really compelling answer for Christians in the first centuries, at least, to say that this new kind of trust, or this new depth of this trust, was meaningful to transform their daily lives. And then the third part of that is the patience of waiting. We've been waiting for 2,000 years, and it's easy to say, well, Jesus will come back tomorrow, or, in the 1840s, we've had all these kind of bizarre notions in the American experience when Jesus is going to return. But I think this patience of waiting, at least the way I understand hope, does not make us passive as Christians. It's supposed to engage our activity. So it's supposed to engage us to be magnanimous. It's supposed to engage us to be courageous. It's supposed to engage us into seeking justice for those who have little or no voice. And so I think there's oftentimes what I hear in churches is this sort of like, I'm going to want to go to heaven. So I have this hope that that's going to do, but it's sort of a passive waiting game, and I don't have to do much until then. But instead, the early Christian witness said, while you're sitting around waiting, you're supposed to be doing this really profoundly important work of being great in the sense that I talk about in the book. If we're made in the image of God, we're called to do great things now, and we have no fear over death any longer. Death has that not final say, and thus we can go out and love our neighbor in new ways. We can go out and be brave in new ways. We can go out and be just in new ways. And I think all of that signals that hope is this really powerful, active response rather than a passive one.
You're listening to Tokens, Public Theology, Human Flourishing, and the Good Life, and we are most grateful to have you joining us. If you have not yet done so, subscribe today to the Tokens podcast on Apple, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your favorite podcasts. We do love hearing from you and are always pleased to hear some of the things you would like to hear more about. You can email us at podcast@tokenshow.com or find us on social media at Token Show, or find me on social media at Lee C. Camp. Grateful to have heard recently from theologian and poet and Professor Donovan Maccabee here in Nashville at Belmont University. Bill Bryson with his awfully generous and kind correspondence writing in from Lebanon, Tennessee. And Dr. Wayman Henson, who's most recently the writer and producer of the documentary Black Farmers in Search of Justice, who wrote in to tell us he found the recent episode with Dr. Quincy Birdsong both stirring and disturbing. Our thanks to each for listening and writing in. Remember, you can sign up for our email list or find out how to join us for a live event, all at tokensshow.com. We would be delighted for you to come see us and join us here in Nashville. This is our interview with Chris Doran. Coming up, we'll hear more from Chris about climate science denial, as well as some theological and practical causes for hope in light of such issues. And if you'd like to hear more related material, then check out our 2 consecutive episodes on climate change and Christianity from Season 3, featuring climate activist Peter Harris and renowned climate scientist Katherine Hayhoe. Part 2 in just a moment. You're listening to the Tokens podcast and our interview with Chris Doran. Given that your description of Christian orthodoxy relates so directly to these issues with which you're concerned, what sort of account do you give for the ways in which supposed conservative Christianity in America has rejected these ideas or has taken seriously climate change denial and acts as if these issues are merely the concern of secular liberals?
There are certainly days where I wake up and can find it very depressing because my own home congregation doesn't take climate change seriously, no matter how much I sort of sit in the back, as it were, and raise my fist or preach on it or give a meditation about it. But I think what has given me some measure of, or a glimmer at least, of hope is that younger people under the age of 35 especially, take climate change a lot more seriously than their uncles and aunts and their parents. And if they are still attracted to Christianity, which surveys show is a little bit harder because church attendance doesn't always sort of match with spiritual focus or desire to know God, we know with younger folks. But as I've taught this class now on sustainability and Christianity for about 15 years now, I have found that more students have wanted to see the holistic approach to their Christianity and that Christianity matters to every part of their life, not just the narrowly construed ways that, quote, conservative Christianity has looked like in the last few decades here in the States. So while stereotypically Christianity, and particularly the conservative forms of it, whether that be politically or theologically, is focused on things like the abortion debate or evolution or LGBTQ issues, what I found with younger students especially is that, and I'm still talking about in the college age, so 18 to 22-year-olds, the idea to talk about food and faith, or the idea to talk about climate migration and faith, or the idea of talking about does my faith really care about clean air, clean water, and decent food? That brings a whole different element to Christianity, which I think is totally true. I say this all the time in my classes. Christianity is the worst religion because it's a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week job. Everything matters. Everything is either under the lordship of Christ or not. Everything either forms you into the likeness of Christ or it deforms you. So you don't get to pick and choose which issues that you want to call Christian and which ones you don't. And I think saying those sorts of things and challenging students to hold me accountable has given them an insight into Christianity that maybe they're not getting sometimes at some other places around the country that have narrowly construed Christianity to these hot button issues, rather than saying, is it all of my life that is under the lordship of Christ? Is it all of my life that changes who I am and not just certain parts of it?
What do you make of the anti-intellectualism among some Christians with regard to this issue?
Yeah, it's a tough one. I mean, I face it at my own university. So I teach at Pepperdine University, and we have students who would prefer to be spoon-fed understanding of Scripture rather than to kind of critically reflect on it. We have administrators at times that can be in that same camp. We have faculty who could be in that same camp sometimes. So there is certainly a cultural milieu, even within universities, that is, sort of like, well, Christianity doesn't have to ask these really hard questions. But I take a lot of solace and refuge, frankly, in the Christian history of 2,000 years that the intellectuals within the Christian tradition always ask the hard questions. I mean, from Augustine to Luther to everyone else that I'm missing, that there is this really profound tradition of asking lots and lots and lots of hard questions. So, I mean, for me personally, I find great comfort in that. As a former scientist, I find even more comfort knowing that so many Christians have been some of the world's greatest scientists and have said, I mean, even currently, Francis Collins, who runs National Institutes of Health, is a very devout Christian and says his Christianity informs what he's doing, not just in the research lab, but for the rest of humanity. I think those things are really important to reflect upon. And I think sometimes it's hard in church services to remind each other that the history of Christianity is far more broad than sometimes the narrow scope of American thought. And I know that's not easy for preachers to dive into, but I think it would be good for us occasionally to remember that we're part of a larger story, and that larger story has lots of critical thinkers. And those folks have only strengthened their faith by critical thinking. They've never sort of shied away from really tough questions and answers.
Speaking of asking hard questions, you're advocating as well seeing critique of social systems as a key element of Christian witness.
Yeah, so one of the things that I sort of profoundly think hope is about is if we know that God wins in the end, and we know that the future that God has provided us and that not yet transferring on to already, it means that certain things now don't have to be this way. we have a vision of what a better place looks like, where you love your neighbors, where you're just to your neighbors, where you actually have clean air, clean water, and decent food. We have visions of what that looks like. We just lack the will to do that at times. And so in my book, students are always wondering why I have 2 chapters on economics in a Christian theological expose on creation care. And one is, I said, well, we used to do a whole month on economics in my religion class, and I shortened that down to 2 chapters. But the chapters talk about the idea of using Sally McFague's language of what would an economic system look like if it was a pale reflection of the kingdom of God. So I argue, for example, that I don't actually think there is a Christian form of economics, but I think Christians can inspire ways of doing economic exchanges or economic systems that say things like sustainability should be forefront, or the interdependence of all creatures is something that would be forefront in God's kingdom. So why can't we be thinking about that now? We might be saying things like, if the vulnerable are left behind in economic policy, would that be something that would be a pale reflection of God's kingdom? And so I think that's where my critique lies of neoliberal thought and some other economic systems, is to say, how can we justify this when the wealth gap, for example, this century has expanded greater than we think at any other time in human civilizational history, right? And those things kind of happen. And so the other chapter of my book on that is, this is not the only virtue that can be employed, but I talk a lot about what it means to be frugal, from that very Christian sense of the term of setting aside something so that you can then meet the needs of other neighbors. And I think there's a critique that frugality can bring on. It's not the only critique, but it is a critique that personally we can set aside things to use in other ways to build relationships, to build communities, and that we need to be thinking about those kind of critiques, because in the case of being frugal, it's using your wealth differently than the modern society says to do. Using your wealth to create community, to create relationships, rather than to hoard things for your own. That, to me, is a pale reflection of God's kingdom.
Any other particular questions you advocate for individuals or families?
Yeah, so the 2 big ones that I deal with all the time that make me pretty unpopular in churches, one is the frugality thing, because while being frugal, I think, was a very huge Protestant virtue in the first few centuries of the American experiment, I think, since the 1960s, 1970s forward, we see, rates of savings going down, of individual savings going down, rates of spending going up. That talking about being frugal as an exercise of love of neighbor is not something that a lot of Christian preachers find popular to do, especially, as you all know, we have this, kind of prosperity gospel phenomenon that is operational still in the US, and that rubs against that. So I talk to folks about that, because it not only has profound environmental consequences, right? If you're consuming less, you are using less resources. That's a net positive for creation, but it also changes the way that you see your possessions. And if you have a more loose association to your possessions and say to yourself, what is it that I have in my house that can be used for God's kingdom? That's a much different relationship with what you have that I think is countercultural in really profound ways. And then the other one that makes me super unpopular is when I start talking about food. And start talking about, what does it mean if you eat industrialized factory farm meat? How much meat should you eat? What does it mean to buy from local farmers versus from large industrial places? And then that gets into another discussion about, there's plenty of, unfortunately, communities of color around our country that don't have grocery stores nearby, and so they don't have access to food. So you have things that are terms like food deserts or food swamps. And so I highlight food pretty heavily because, for my students at least, probably their most heavy carbon footprint activity that they engage in every day is eating. And so there is a way of engaging in food that we can see God or not see God more clearly. And I think that our inability to engage in that is to disconnect, at least from my tradition, saying that the Eucharist or the Lord's Supper is something we practice every week, seems to me problematic when you say, oh yeah, it's a real big deal on Sunday, but I'm not going to connect those habits that I learned, those table manners, as it were, to the rest of my week of eating. That we have this complete disconnect from Sunday to the rest of the week. And what I found in the early Christian witness is they wanted to have a discussion about their Christianity every single day of the week. It wasn't just a Sunday only activity. And I think the first couple of challenges in the church were over meat eating, which we just love to sort of pass over, as it were. But I think the food is another one that I get into a lot of interesting chats about.
Any particular critique of social policies that are top of the list for you?
Ooh, that's a good one. Yeah, I mean, I think, where I'm at right now, I watch food policy development quite a lot because we subsidize lots of bad calories, and those subsidies end up being accumulated by a small number of transnational corporations so they can continue to grow their wallets while generations of small family farms are being continue to be eroded and to be taken off the landscape. And so food, as it becomes cheaper and cheaper in the US, nutritionally dense food becomes more expensive. It's just this weird perversion. It's the first time in human history that we know about where, broccoli is more expensive than a cheeseburger, and the sort of the problems of obesity and diabetes and other things that come from that are profound, especially in communities of color. So that's lots of different things on food policy that I'm involved in. And the other one, the new research project that I'm working on is on climate migration, that if we listen to not just scientists, but national security experts and other military advisors around the planet, we know that we could have between 1 billion and 2 billion. So put together India and China, the populations of those type moving by the end of the century. Now, whether that's internal displacement moving within their country or external displacement trying to find a new home altogether, we have some significant problems that we have never seen before in human history, that kind of migration event in such a short amount of time. And as you can imagine, there's lots of different security issues that come with that, but also the sort of xenophobia that we see in our country and the EU and other places. And that's migrant movement of 1 million or 2 million people. Now we're talking about that on a much, much greater number. So I think Christians on both food issues and both on migration issues can inject different understandings of conversations into this global discussion because they can say things about justice, they can say things about care for the poor and the widows and the non-citizens in ways that as secular folks cannot, I believe at least. I think we have unique perspectives to offer that just don't come from secular places.
Signs of hope in the sense that you describe hope, exemplars, folks that you're seeing take the sort of challenges you're raising seriously?
There's small movements all over the planet that are happening. Women in India and parts of East Africa that are teaching each other to build solar panels so that they have electricity and they can have their kids do their homework at night. There's different farm projects all over the planet that are happening. Just even something here in the States, like the rise in farmers markets and community supported agriculture is, I don't know technically if it's exponential, but the rise is great. And we're seeing people wanting to get better understanding of their food than probably the last 2 or 3 generations. And so I think those are small bits of hope. Obviously, having a new presidential administration that says climate change is real is a glimmer of hope. That doesn't mean the work is done. We have quite a long way to go to catch up with where the science says we need to catch up. But I think the big one that I see, at least, that does inspire me. So, for example, here at Pepperdine, where we have a huge population, I would say 30 to 40% of our students probably have some form of climate denial because the status quo sort of benefits them. I started the sustainability program here at Pepperdine, and from 2015 to now, we've had a pretty big growth. And so right now, as of this morning, I have 60 students in a program that receives no formal funding from the university. So, to think that there's 60 students and growing is a really big deal to me. About 85% of those are females, which to me is really inspiring. That we're seeing around the world is that more often than not that women take leadership roles in their communities. There's longer lasting climate and environmental protection and creation of these kind of renewable technology grants and other things that are going on. So I'm really excited by that. It's a small bit, but I think in this case, we all need to be looking at our own communities on these kinds of small things. And the other thing that I find important on this, it's not always a glimmer of hope, but I think we're seeing more people start to connect the dots here in the US between extreme weather events and climate change for the first time ever. So national poll after national poll says more Americans than not believe that climate change is real and a serious thing. They're not always connecting that to policy, but at least they're saying that. The discouraging thing, I don't mean to end on a discouraging thing, but the discouraging thing is that Christians tend to lag way behind the general American public on those about taking the seriousness of climate change. But again, if I want to take some small solace, it's that younger Christians are taking this more seriously. And the younger Christians, the 18 to 30-year-olds, are saying, if I'm going to stay in your church, I need to hear that you're taking this seriously. And that's a new wave that I hope older Christians will begin to take more seriously. Younger Christians are not holding their elders hostage. What they're saying is either Christianity matters or it doesn't. And I think that's a challenge that all of us as Christians should take up if we want to transmit the traditions, as it were. If we want to hand that tradition on to the next generation, then we need to take seriously what they say is going on.
Been talking to Chris Doran, professor of religion at Pepperdine University in Malibu, California, about his recent book, Hope in the Age of Climate Change, Creation Care This Side of the Resurrection. Thank you so much, Chris.
Thank you, Lee. I really appreciate the opportunity. This has been fun.
You have been listening to Tokens Public Theology, Human Flourishing, and the Good Life. If you would like to hear more related material, then check out our 2 consecutive episodes on climate change from Season 3, successively featuring climate activist Peter Harris and renowned climate scientist Katherine Hayhoe. Remember, you can subscribe to our podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your favorite podcasts. And would you love on us a bit by doing 2 things for us? 1, go over to iTunes and give us one of those glowing 5-star reviews. And 2, tell a friend about the Tokens podcast. Our thanks to all the stellar team that makes this podcast possible: Christy Bragg, Jacob Lewis, Ashley Bain, Leslie Thompson, Tom Anderson, Carrie Harmon, and Phil Barnett. Music beds by Zach and Maggie White and Blue Dot Sessions. Live performance you'll be hearing in just a moment, performed live by Buddy Green, along with Jeff Taylor, Aubrey Haney, Byron House, Brian Sutton, and Josh Hunt. And a special thanks to Hunter Stanfield for envisioning this particular episode. On our way out, here's a beautiful old hymn sung by our friend Buddy Green on one of our live shows. Actually, it was a night of old hymns, delightful evening. This old hymn fits this podcast episode in quite lovely fashion, I think. Hope you enjoy.
This is my Father's world, and to my listening ears all nature sings, and round me rings the music of the spheres. This is my Father's world, I rest me in the thought of rocks and trees, of skies and seas, His hand the wonders wrought. This is my Father's world. The birds their carols raise, the morning light and the lily white declare their Maker's praise. This is my Father's world, He shines in all that's fair. In the rustling grass I hear Him pass, He speaks to me everywhere. Father's world. Oh, let me never forget that though the wrongs seems all so strong. God is the ruler, yeah. This is my Father's word. Why should my heart be sad? The Lord is King, let the heavens ring. God reigns, let the earth be glad. This is my Father's word. The battle is not done. Jesus who died shall be satisfied, and earth and heaven be one.
Thanks for listening. Peace be unto thee, and come see us in Nashville. The Tokens Podcast is a production of Tokens Media, LLC, and
Great Feeling Studios.